Horror is one of the oldest and most enduring film genres, with roots dating back to the very beginnings of cinema itself. From landmark silent films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, to modern masterpieces like The Exorcist and Get Out, horror movies have thrilled, disturbed, and fascinated audiences for over a century. Unlike some genres that have waxed and waned in popularity, horror remains perennially popular, with new generations of directors reimagining the genre and putting their own distinctive stamps on classic horror themes and conventions. This longevity speaks to the way horror taps into our primal fears and darkest anxieties in a safe, socially acceptable setting. We revel in the suspense, the adrenaline rush, and the cathartic payoff that comes with surviving a well-crafted fright. This article will explore the history and evolution of the horror genre, highlighting some of the most influential films and filmmakers that have shaped its development from the early 20th century to today. We'll see how the style and focus of horror movies has shifted in various cultural moments, and how the genre has ingeniously reinvented itself decade after decade. But through all its permutations, horror retains its essential power to titillate and terrorize. The origins of horror entertainment can be traced back to the 18th century, when Gothic novels first rose in popularity. These stories focused on the terrifying, supernatural, and macabre, taking inspiration from medieval architecture and ruins. Horror icons like vampires, werewolves, ghosts, and monsters frequently appeared in Gothic tales. These books paved the way for horror as a distinct genre. In the 19th century, cheap penny dreadfuls and dime novels brought horror to the masses. These sensationalist stories reprinted classics like Frankenstein and introduced new horror, mystery, and crime characters. Penny dreadfuls were looked down upon as lurid entertainment, but they captured the public's imagination. The demand for chilling stories you could read in just a few hours helped horror continue gaining traction with mainstream audiences. The early years of horror films were greatly influenced by German Expressionism and the classic Universal monsters. German Expressionism was an artistic movement in the 1910s and 1920s that made use of distorted sets, strange angles, stark lighting, and exaggerated acting. Films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, 1920, and Nosferatu, 1922, used these techniques to create an unsettling, nightmarish mood. The disorienting visuals of German Expressionism would have a huge impact on the look and feel of future horror films. In the 1930s and 1940s, Universal Studios released a string of hugely popular monster movies that became known as the Universal Monsters. Films like Dracula, 1931, Frankenstein, 1931, The Mummy, 1932, and The Wolfman, 1941, introduced iconic monsters and monster stars like Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, and Lon Chaney Jr. These films established many of the classic horror tropes and conventions that are still being used today. With their Gothic settings, practical effects, and focus on supernatural monsters, the Universal horror movies paved the way for decades of fright films to come. Alfred Hitchcock is one of the most renowned and influential directors in the history of cinema. Though he worked in a variety of genres, he became known as the master of suspense for his pioneering work in the thriller and horror genres. Hitchcock's 1960 film Psycho was a major turning point in horror cinema. The film tells the story of Marion Crane, a woman on the run after stealing money from her employer, who makes the fateful decision to stay at the Bates Motel. The film featured one of the most famous scenes in movie history, the shocking murder of Marion Crane in the shower at the Bates Motel. The quick editing and violent nature of this scene was highly unusual for the time, and marked a major shift toward more graphic content in mainstream films. Psycho was controversial but also a major commercial and critical success, demonstrating the powerful appeal of horror when done well. Another signature film was The Birds from 1963, which featured swarms of aggressive birds randomly attacking people in a small California town. As with Psycho, the film emphasized psychological horror and suspense over gore or graphic violence. Hitchcock used innovative visual effects and eerie sound design to create an overwhelming sense of dread and anxiety. The ambiguous nature of the attacks tapped into a fear of nature turning against humanity in an unpredictable manner. The Bird stands as one of Hitchcock's most frightening and effective films. Overall, Hitchcock was a pioneer in using cinematic techniques to manipulate emotions and maximize suspense. He carefully choreographed scenes to wring out every bit of tension, often dragging out the suspense for as long as possible before reaching a peak. Hitchcock understood thrillers were as much about the anticipation of violence and horror as the acts themselves. His work established many techniques and approaches that are now staples of horror and suspense films decades later. Hitchcock proved horror could be thoughtful, psychologically rich cinema worthy of serious acclaim. He set new standards for horror and elevated it to previously unseen levels of artistry and critical recognition in film. Hammer horror refers to the horror films produced by the British Hammer Film Productions Company from the mid-1950s through the 1970s. Under the leadership of Anthony Hines, Hammer became synonymous with horror, specializing in Gothic tales full of vivid colors, sexual innuendo, and graphic violence. Some of Hammer's most famous films were inspired by classic horror characters like Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Mummy. Their 1958 Dracula, starring Christopher Lee as Count Dracula and Peter Cushing as Van Helsing, was a major hit that launched a wave of sequels throughout the 60s and 70s. Lee's imposing height and seductive menace made him the definitive Dracula of his generation. The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957 was another breakthrough Gothic horror film for Hammer. It established the iconic partnership between Lee and Cushing, who would go on to collaborate on many horror films as adversaries. Hammer's Frankenstein series emphasized gore and transgressive themes not found in the Universal monster movies of the 30s and 40s. As a British studio, Hammer evoked the Gothic heritage of 19th-century literature and the foggy atmospherics of the English countryside in their set designs. This was a departure from the continental European settings of the Universal monster films. Their lurid use of technicolor enhanced the bloody scenes that often pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable at the time. Hammer's unique British spin on classic horror icons made their films hugely popular both in the UK and abroad. They demonstrated that horror cinema was still viable and profitable in the post-Universal era. Hammer's Gothic horrors left an indelible mark on the genre. The 1960s and 70s marked a turning point for horror films, with lower budgets enabling more creative freedom and the rating system allowing for more graphic content. George A. Romero's 1968 Night of the Living Dead reinvented the zombie genre with its grimy black-and-white aesthetic and graphic depiction of the undead. Made on a tiny $114,000 budget, the film raked in $30 million and inspired countless imitators with its fresh take on horror. In 1973, The Exorcist brought the demonic possession subgenre into the mainstream, becoming one of the highest-grossing films at the time. Based on a novel, the religious thriller depicted a 12-year-old girl's shocking demonic possession and exorcism in visceral detail. The Exorcist paved the way for more satanic horror in The Omen and beyond. Slasher films also came to prominence during this era. John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween codified tropes like the mysterious killer stalking suburban teens. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1974 and Black Christmas 1974 also helped develop the subgenre with their shocking portrayals of murder. While condemned as exploitative, these slashers proved hugely lucrative and continue to influence horror today. The 1980s marked a resurgence for the horror genre, largely due to the rise of the slasher film. While slashers had existed previously, the 1980s saw them rise to new heights of popularity and define the era. Two of the most iconic slasher villains emerged in the 1980s, Jason Voorhees of Friday the 13th and Freddy Krueger of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Friday the 13th, 1980, introduced audiences to the hockey mask-wearing killer Jason Voorhees, who dispatched camp counselors at Camp Crystal Lake. Though Jason was not the killer in the original film, he went on to become the main antagonist and star of the Friday the 13th franchise. Meanwhile, A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984, brought horror icon Freddy Krueger, whose burnt visage and signature clawed glove made him instantly recognizable. Freddy invaded his victims' dreams, making sleep a terrifying and dangerous prospect. Actor Robert Englund's sinister performance launched Freddy into the pop culture stratosphere. The popularity of Jason and Freddy sparked a slasher boom, with countless films trying to replicate the formula of creative kills and menacing villains. Some other popular slashers included Michael Myers of Halloween, Leatherface of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Chucky the Killer Doll of Child's Play. While they lacked the nuance and artistry of earlier horror films, slashers were hugely popular with audiences and defined horror for a generation of moviegoers. The decade's slasher craze demonstrated the enduring appeal of horror films and villains. The 1990s saw a resurgence in mainstream horror films, largely thanks to hits like The Silence of the Lambs and Scream. After the slasher boom of the 1980s petered out, horror fans wondered what was next for the genre. In 1991, The Silence of the Lambs offered a psychological and cerebral approach to horror, while still providing plenty of chilling moments. The film dominated the box office and Academy Awards, demonstrating horror could be both popular entertainment and acclaimed art. The Silence of the Lambs set the stage for a decade where horror would blur lines between prestige drama and blockbuster thrills. Director Jonathan Demme brought an artistic sensibility to the film, subverting horror tropes and exploring deeper themes like psychology, feminism, and morality. While The Silence of the Lambs brought horror critical acclaim, Scream in 1996 brought the crowds back to theaters. With its meta approach skewering slasher cliches, Scream kicked off a new wave of self-aware horror. Kevin Williamson's script was loaded with references to horror films and tropes, bringing a knowing wink to the genre. Scream recognized audiences had seen it all before, so it playfully toyed with expectations. Scream also reinvigorated the slasher genre for a new generation. By both embracing and satirizing slasher conventions, Scream made the subgenre feel fresh again. Slasher films came roaring back in the late 1990s with I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, and others capitalizing on Scream's successful formula. Thanks to films like The Silence of the Lambs and Scream, mainstream horror enjoyed a creative and commercial resurgence in the 1990s, after years of direct-to-video obscurity. The films brought prestige and smarts back to horror, paving the way for the genre's continued success. Horror films have had an enormous impact on pop culture and our shared fears. Even though we may recoil and cover our eyes during a scary movie, we keep coming back for more. Why is that? Part of the appeal is that horror allows us to face our deepest fears in a safe environment. The thrills and chills are an adrenaline rush, and overcoming them gives us a sense of courage. Horror also lets us explore taboo topics like death and evil. By confronting the dark side, we can appreciate the light in the world and in ourselves. Another reason we love horror is its imagination and creativity. Horror at its best pushes boundaries and shows you things we've never seen before. The masters of horror are expert world builders, crafting terrifying scenarios that reveal truths about humanity. Good horror makes us look at the world in a new way. Finally, horror brings people together through shared experience. Watching a scary movie with friends, holding hands or screaming together, creates a bond. We take comfort in community and knowing we're not alone in being afraid. Horror fans form a subculture united by fascination with the macabre. The legacy of horror is its insight into human psychology, its ever-evolving creativity, and the community it inspires. As long as darkness lingers in the human condition, we'll keep telling stories to shine a light on our deepest fears. The masters of horror have honed that craft, and will continue influencing culture for generations to come.